we're continuing with the response of Rabbi Weiss, Rabbi Asher Weiss in the Minchat Asher about whether or not to say El Melech Ne'eman before the Shema when engaged in davening such as we are on Zoom. And Rabbi Weiss yesterday was up to the point of considering whether the din of Shomea Ka'oneh applies. That din, just as a quick reminder, an example of that din is if there's one person making kiddush for others on Friday night, not just for him or herself, that the others should pay attention, answer Amen at the end, and it's as if they have said kiddush themselves, and then of course they drink the wine. Just a familiar example. Rabbi Weiss refers in considering this question, not just about Shomea Ka'oneh, but our question in general, to the famous shul in Alexandria, which of course the Talmud says was so big that there were Gabaim whose job it were to wave flags. I always kind of pictured in my mind in the Egyptian Football League at the time. You can imagine different flags being waved and people would know when to say Amen, etc. That's the purpose of waving flags, was to help people understand or to know when they needed to respond, because it was so big and it didn't always be the Chazan. So when the flag was waved, then people would know that it was time to say Amen or the other relevant response. So Rabbi Weiss suggests this is a possibility to consider, but he says it's by no means conclusive that Shomea Ka'oneh applies, especially since, coming back to what we said a couple of days ago in introducing this topic, saying the words El Melech Ne'eman has a curious background to it that does not necessarily seem to have its basis in the Gemara. And even if the 248 words represent the 248 positive mitzvot, then of course there's no person that can do all of the 248 positive mitzvot. Some are for men, some are for women, some are in Israel, some are just for Kohanim, etc., etc. So, as I mentioned, perhaps another time we'll look at the whole concept in a bit more detail. But nonetheless, for our purposes, he says, the nafkamina, the practical ramification of this discussion is as follows. If the din of Shomea Ka'oneh, the law of Shomea Ka'oneh applies, then does it work if you are listening to davening over the telephone or over Zoom? Okay? And if it doesn't apply, if it does apply, then perhaps it's okay to hear the Chazan say Hashem Elokechem Emet, as we've mentioned, and therefore you wouldn't need to say El Melech Ne'eman. So if Shomea Ka'oneh doesn't work over Zoom, you should say El Melech Ne'eman. If on the other hand, there's a possibility it does apply, or we don't really mind if you say El Melech Ne'eman or not, because the Chazan will say Hashem Elokechem Emet. Maybe that is the preference, and therefore you should rely on the Chazan saying that, not say El Melech Ne'eman yourself. So Rabbi Weiss says he hasn't managed to, as we said, the context here is at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, he was dealing with 1,001 things. So he says, Lo yaradzi ketzad hachriya bazeh. I haven't managed to really get to the depths of the question to work out precisely how to decide the matter. And he says that he feels there, in principle, there is no obligation to say El Melech Ne'eman, and especially since there is a question in Halacha as to whether hearing things, which is noted over the telephone or over Zoom, is considered hearing for halachic purposes, because it's not the original voice, it's all scrambled electronically, or whatever the correct term is, as thinking about questions relating to the Megillah on Purim and other such things. And therefore he says, perhaps you should say it, because if you hear Chazan say Hashem Elokechem Emet, maybe it's too scrambled electronically, it's not really the voice of the Chazan. But on the other hand, you've heard him say it, and there's not really an obligation per se, so maybe it's okay to hear the Chazan. So therefore, there is no, at least in this response, no final decision. It would seem that either path is correct, as long as you're doing one or the other. But he says, certainly if you said Hashem Elokechem, if you said El Melech Ne'eman, you haven't lost anything. So it's not, you've not even done nothing wrong if you've said it, but it just might not be strictly necessary. So hopefully that gives us some background and explanation as to why we've been davening as we have over Zoom, and what to do if, unfortunately, we'll have to resume this again after the current lockdown ends. In the meantime, have a great day.
Rabbi Leitner?
Yes.